very much London Philharmonic Orchestra, who did not make that specifically for this podcast recording.
Oh, man, I thought they did.
What's going on, everyone? Larry and Anthony here for another retro video game podcast, which eventually I guess we'll find a title for. More than retro video game podcast.
Why don't we just call it Larry and Anthony's Retro Video Game Podcast?
Because I don't like... Sure, why not? All right, so we can do that. But patent pending. So we're on here today, folks, and thank you very much for listening, downloading. Just download the show. You can delete it later. We just want to get the numbers. Pretty much, again, what all this always comes about is just kind of just BSing on the side. And last time we spoke, you mentioned the Virtual Boy. Last time we were podcasting.
Yes, that wonderful system that only you purchased.
Yes, me and 15 other people. And by God, I still have 4 games for it. But
so sad.
It made us wonder. I mean, look, all right, fine. The Virtual Boy was a complete dismal disaster.
Yes, it was.
And it lasted less than a year. So, kind of made you wonder, what other... Not every video game system is an Xbox or a PlayStation, as far as success. There's been a few game systems, both big and small, that really have not even barely had a cup of coffee in the business.
Pretty much, yeah.
So, and, I mean, there's, I'm sure, too many to name, too many to think about. Some which you think didn't last long, but actually lasted longer than you thought it would.
We'll talk about those, too.
Yeah, and right off the bat, besides the Virtual Boy, what are just some marketing disasters that you can think of that just came out? Even something that you thought was going to be fantastic, and when you played it, it was just absolute garbage.
Oh, well, well, I guess the first one I can come up with is the Sega CD. I remember when that came out, because that was actually the first, at least to my knowledge, the first video game system that became available where you can actually play games on a CD.
Reasonably priced.
Right, exactly. And I was really excited about it because it was like, oh, it's an extension to your Genesis, and the Genesis was such an awesome system. I was like, okay, this is a can't miss. It's like you can hold, it can hold more information on it. I remember what specifically sold it to me, like the whole concept of Sega CD was not Dana Plato in that awful game Night Trap. Yeah, that game Night Trap, where but it was WWF Rage in the Cage. Now I've been a big wrestling fan my whole life, and when I found out that this game was coming out, and it had, at that point, it had 20 playable characters. Now, 20 playable characters in a video game back then was ridiculous, because at the time, Super Nintendo and Genesis had WWF Royal Rumble, Super WrestleMania, Raw, which only held 12.
Yeah.
This one had 20. And not only did it have 20 superstars, it had their entrance music in it.
Which is big time.
Right, and it also, I believe, if I remember correctly, had a video intro for which was for the first time ever, which was unprecedented. Yeah. So that sold me on the Sega CD right away. And then I got it, hooked it up to my Genesis, came with a game called Sewer Shark.
Yes! 6, 9er, 4.
Right, which was basically a memory game, so you could turn through it. I actually really enjoyed that game too, even though you can beat it in about 25 minutes. Yep. Fun game. But the system overall was just, it really was the Genesis. I mean, most of the decent games on there, they had Genesis graphics.
Sonic CD.
Yeah, Sonic CD, which was an amazing game. Yeah. Rage in the Cage, like I mentioned. And then outside of that, I mean, everything else on it was just kind of mediocre.
I think what happened was, for the time, when did that come out? 91?
Somewhere around there.
92, maybe? Trying to remember, because I remember... I got it for Christmas. I remember I accidentally saw it being wrapped.
Is that when you found out there was no Santa?
I don't know what you're talking about. But I remember whenever it was early 90s, no matter what, bottom line, it was early 90s. And I think what happened was back then, because of the whole CD thing, I think they were trying to push the video, the live action video.
It was 92.
92, okay.
Yep.
Like Sewer Shark, like Night Trap. I know there's a couple, and there's a handful of games that you can list.
I still have Mighty Morphin Power Rangers for Sega CD.
But that was a regular. Wait, was that live action?
It was. What they did with the game was it was 5 episodes from the first season of the show.
Okay.
And all that you did was when they went for a kick, you had to press up at the right time. Or you lost energy. Yeah. So basically, you were pressing directions and buttons just so you can watch the episode.
It was like come on, Space Ace. The other one was the first one.
Yes.
Dragon's Lair.
It was like Dragon's Lair. Exactly.
All right, so that's for the times, but it did have its games, and I liked it personally. I thought the games were good, but it did. I mean, how long? It lasted a couple years.
Yeah, right? I think it lasted 2 years or so before they pulled it. If I remember correctly, actually, it was discontinued about 4 years.
All right, so 4, that's a good run. That's especially in the mid '90s.
It's a decent run, and it was one of the ones where it's like I don't feel necessarily like if we were judging on this podcast. Gone too soon, or it lived its life. I think it actually lived its life,
or overstayed its welcome.
It might have overstayed its welcome a little bit too, because by the time it was discontinued, PlayStation was coming out. So
yeah, to be fair, really nothing overstays its welcome now with retro. But then you get like something like the Virtual Boy, or something like the 32, the Genesis 30. Sega was notorious. The 32X.
Yeah, the 32X was an absolute disaster.
32X didn't work. First of all, it's working off of, I'm still trying to figure out how the 32X can run off of the Genesis platform and still supposed to boost the graphics up to 32-bit. Like, you would think it'd be a whole new system. All it was just an add-on that you just plopped on top of the Genesis.
Well, I think what it was is it was just like, I almost equated it to you're just adding another 16 bits to it.
Pretty much it.
But no, I mean it's just all coded into the little motherboard and the thing.
And they even had a Genesis. They even had a 32X CD,
right? Which played the 32X games and the Sega CD games.
No. It was it was like souped up CD games.
Oh, well,
which I think you still played on the Sega CD. So I don't understand how that worked.
Well, I think Sega maybe at that point was just really marveling in how great their Genesis was and was trying to make as much money as possible. The Sega 32X was a disaster. I bought it years later.
Oh, did you?
Years later. I didn't buy it new. I bought it years later from Funkoland because again, WWF will always be. They'll be my undoing. I bought it specifically just so I can play the one extra character in Raw. And it was such a waste of money.
Good old Quang.
Yes. So sad. And it was Quang.
It was. And as far as like the home systems, I'm trying to think, because then you think of a system like Dreamcast, where, don't get me wrong, I love Dreamcast, but I felt like it lasted forever, but really it wasn't. It was only around for maybe a year and a half, right?
It was in North America. It was around about a year and a half. It came out in I can still remember the marketing for $99.99 with that Dreamcast logo, and then they pulled the plug in March of 2001. That's a system I think was definitely gone too soon because, to be honest with you, I thought the graphics were great. Dreamcast was also the first system at that point that had an online component to it. Yeah. I know.
Well, you had that.
Well, Nintendo tried to do that,
and you had that. What was that thing that it was called? Not the Sega Channel. It was some. It only it worked for 2 games: Mortal Kombat and NBA Jam. You're able to.
I remember that. I forgot what it was too. But Dreamcast was the first one to actually sport. Like it had the Ethernet cable in it, so that you were able to go online and play games,
which I never did.
Yeah. And you know what? To this day, I still have my Dreamcast, and Sonic Adventure was by far and away my favorite Sonic game. That was period. Game. It was an amazing game. Space Channel 5 was like one of those first music related games that was actually kind of fun. It also had a Michael Jackson cameo on top of it. But the problem with the Dreamcast is they just could not get third-party rights. Yeah. And that essentially doomed them because there just wasn't a variety of games, so people didn't buy the system, which is what and also Dreamcast is the last system Sega ever put out.
Yeah, no, true. And you think it worked because Dreamcast was really the first system I remember to have equal arcade quality graphics.
Yeah.
Just spitting straight off the motherboard, straight onto a disc.
Oh, yeah.
I remember playing Crazy Taxi. Mm-hmm. It was anything beyond what I saw because it felt like a true arcade.
Yeah, it was beautiful. It was clean. It was smooth. I played Resident Evil Code Veronica on there.
Yes.
And I believe at that point, and it may still be true, I don't think it ever made... I think Code Veronica was only made for the Dreamcast.
Eventually re-released it, but
they re-released it, but originally, it was specifically just for the Dreamcast, and that game was fantastic. Absolutely loved it. And I'm really sorry Sega wound up going out of the console business because of the failure of the Dreamcast, because I think it had the capability to be a success. Third parties did not agree with that. Yeah. Well, neither did Sony or Microsoft.
But I guess it's better. I mean, they're still making games, so it's not bad. It's kind of weird to finally see Sonic cross over to Nintendo, especially from Nintendo, because Microsoft, Sony, they came later, but Sega and Nintendo, they were the rivals, and to see now Sonic and Tails and all them on a Nintendo platform, like the winter games and all that, it's just kind of funny.
Well, the perfect home for Sonic is Nintendo. I I can see Sonic living on Xbox or PlayStation, but I mean, they just fit in so well with the Mario universe and stuff like that. So.
And then, there's some other systems out there. Now, I think we all remember the Atari Jaguar, which in itself stunk, but it lasted.
Well, the funny thing is, they touted that as the first 64-bit system, but it was actually 16-bit graphics on a 64-bit background or something of that nature. They definitely fudged it.
They finagled it.
Yeah, they definitely fudged it. So for that reason alone, then again, I never bought it, thankfully.
No, neither did I, no.
And for that reason alone, I'm happy it did not survive.
Now, it didn't survive, but it lasted a little while.
It lasted 4 years.
But the Jaguar CD, that did not last at all.
Oh no, that was an absolute disaster.
And I don't ever remember. Honestly, I don't even remember hearing about the Jaguar CD when it was new. It was only later on, just years later, and going to trade places and everything for video games, that I even discovered they made a Jaguar CD.
Yeah, I mean, it was one of those weird things where it's I don't even think it lasted a year at that point, because I think the Jaguar was already taking a dive.
Yeah, it was already on its way out.
And since they had already developed the Jaguar CD, they had to release it in hopes that maybe that would help with sales, and it did absolutely nothing.
And then as far now, those are really kind of the big systems, because I can't think of anything else that was. Well, no, hold on. What am I talking about? Just recently, to try and counteract Microsoft and Sony, what was it? OnLive.
OnLive.
Remember that? OnLive. It was meant to be a micro console. The whole idea was the games were in the cloud, and you just play straight off the cloud. The system itself was probably no bigger than almost like a
USB flash drive.
No. It was a little bit bigger, like a Roku box or an Apple TV.
Makes sense.
Actually, to be honest with you, because it's kind of like what the Amazon Fire TV is like. So, but it was all meant to be on the cloud. You don't have to buy the games. At least you don't have to buy. There was no physical games, because you couldn't fit a CD into it. And they were going to go head to head with Microsoft and with Sony, and just did not work. I think they fell flat on their face. I think they were out for maybe a year, if not just a few months.
Well, I think
short of a year.
I think the trouble now today is that it's hard to get into the console business because Microsoft and Sony have such a death grip on it.
True.
That to come out with something completely new is the risk is that everybody's already, gamers today are already kind of loyal. They're loyal to their PC, their Microsoft, or their Sony, and to an extension, Nintendo hangs around because of their hardcore gamers.
Oh yeah,
they're hardcore Nintendo gamers. So I think even though, Nintendo has been struggling for years because they haven't been able to keep up with Sony and Microsoft, somebody else coming out with a complete third-party brand new system, it's, I don't want to say it's doomed to fail. I just want to say
it's hard to start.
It's really hard to start because you have to lure away people who are perfectly happy with their Xboxes and their PlayStations and their Nintendos.
Now, tell me if you remember some of these. We may have a special guest, folks. So, but tell me if you remember some of these. Even there's the list there, buddy.
Yeah, I see the list. The one that I'll bring up right now. Well, first off, I can't talk about Virtual Boy while you're stepping away for a second because
why not?
Because you own one, and I have to make fun of you. But I think one of the ones that has surprised me that lived longer than it should have was the Neo Geo system. And the reason why that surprises me is because the Neo Geo system, when it first came out, it was $650, which was pretty expensive in the early 90s. So on top of that, the games for that system were $300 a pop because there were 4 or 5 games on a disc. I'm talking about the Neo Geo. And yet, for some odd reason, the Neo Geo lasted somewhere around 12 or 13 years.
Pretty much. And you may have heard that doorbell. We actually have a special guest here today who probably actually created most of these video games. Our other Anthony C. Anthony, welcome to the show, Retro Video Game World.
Thank you very much. Pleasure and honor for me to be here.
You may have heard his voice may sound familiar as well. Here you go. You can take a seat right there.
Thank you very much, sir.
And Anthony, maybe you can kind of weigh in on this, as now I'm going to confuse everyone with two Anthonys.
I think we sound completely different, so I'm sure it's fine.
We sure about that?
No.
Video games, systems. Can you remember a video game system that you remember looking forward to, and then it just kind of fizzing out real quick?
Yes.
Best example we kept talking about was a Virtual Boy.
Okay.
Where it just didn't even last a year.
Well, you had those weird-ass goggles, and you had to...
Virtual Boy was awesome.
Awful.
Okay, podcast world. I'm going to give you my 2 cents, literally, on this right now. The one I remember that really didn't... It had its moment, but then it really faded faster than when it had its moment, was TurboGrafx.
Oh, yeah, all right. Yep.
Yeah.
That
didn't last too long.
Honestly, TurboGrafx was the very first. Was it like 8 or 16-bit graphic
16.
game?
No, it was 16.
And it was the first, right? The problem is they didn't market it correctly. It was the games at that time. I know that nowadays every damn thing is sensitive nowadays, but back then the fighting games they had, all these other games that they had for the system. Were really, really somewhat controversial because it wasn't
Splatterhouse.
Yeah, it wasn't for kids.
No.
And if you
Splatterhouse was awesome, by the way.
It was a great game.
It was fantastic for us, right? But the game world was really, really catered more towards families, entertainment like NES, that type of thing. TurboGrafx really changed a lot.
And actually, TurboGrafx 16 only lasted 2 years, which I thought it lasted a little bit longer, but I knew it didn't. Now the Turbo CD,
it actually lasted longer than that. It lasted about 5 years here.
Oh.
In the U.S. The thing, it came out in the late '80s, roughly around the time that Super Nintendo and Genesis were about to come out.
And then it didn't have that much of an impact. Then.
Yeah, that was the problem with it. In the States, it didn't have a big enough impact.
Well, they also tried to do. Remember, they had the Turbo Express, where it was the handheld, but you can bring the game with you.
Yes.
That you play at home. And the TurboGrafx CD, I know that didn't last too long either.
No,
but you're right, though, because now that I think about it, I don't remember the marketing too much. I remember it fizzing out like right before the 90s. I don't really remember anyone having it in the 90s. Mm-hmm. TurboGrafx CD. I never owned a TurboGrafx.
Well, the reason why it lasted as long as it did, though, is because the sales over in Japan were actually really high quality. It sold about 10 million units in Japan, and that's why it lasted as long as it did. But it didn't translate over to the U.S. the way that the NES and the SNES did, or the Sega did.
Didn't SNK also have sort of their own mini system as well?
Neo Geo? SNK. Well, SNK published on Neo Geo.
Oh, okay. Because
Neo Geo lasted
they
somehow.
Had an import, no?
Well, they were probably big on that because a lot of the arcades were imports.
Oh, yeah.
But
SNK games were mostly on the Neo Geo, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, they were each like $900. Now, tell me if you remember this. Tell me if you remember some of these if I mention it. And I don't know if you were talking about it before. You remember the N-Gage?
Yes. Holy crap.
The taco-shaped cell phone that also doubled as a video game system?
Oh, my Lord.
And even after they redesigned... All right, first of all, if you don't remember the N-Gage, look it up right now. Google it. It was a cell phone. It looked like a half moon, kind of, sort of. Or a half a circle, I should say. So the idea is perfect. It's a portable video game system. That works fine. That's also a cell phone. This probably came out... When did the cell phone craze hit? So this probably came out like 2002, 2003 maybe, the N-Gage, maybe a little bit later on. But the problem is when you talked on the N-Gage, you had to talk on it on the edge, so it looked like you held a taco to your head to actually talk to people on the cell phone part.
What's wrong with having a taco on you?
And then they redesigned it and it looked a little bit better, but the system itself just failed.
That looked
failed
delicious.
miserably.
Funny you say that. Now let me ask you gentlemen a question now. Scenario based, okay? If, let's say, the N-Gage was updated for the way it is now, okay, with the cell phone world, with the technology that we have now, would it last?
Well, they last now.
It was a beautiful concept.
No. Well, it's hard to say because the N-Gage would have eventually turned into something that looks like a Galaxy or an iPhone.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, all right. I'm not saying this in a fanboy perspective. All phones nowadays look like an iPhone.
But for its time,
it was
very
yes.
revolutionary.
It stunk, but it was revolutionary. Do you remember the Game.com?
No.
Yeah, exactly.
I remember hearing of it, but I don't remember.
It was from, well, first of all, do you remember the Tiger Electronic Games?
Yes, of course.
Okay, so Tiger Electronic tried to make this Game.com. It was supposed to be like the first game that had a touchscreen.
Yes.
And it actually did go online.
Oh, man.
On their own server, but you can play other people. It was horrible. It stunk. It looked like you were using an old school PDA. So, yeah, it was kind of rough to run there. This pen don't work.
All you young kids nowadays don't know how good we had it back in the day.
And then going back to Nintendo, now nothing will beat the Virtual Boy. Virtual Boy will always be the top of this list. But you guys are familiar with like the history.
What, I've gone too soon or overstayed its welcome?
Listen, I still swear by the Virtual Boy. The games were Mario Clash and Wario Land were fantastic.
Yeah, if you weren't having an epileptic seizure
well,
while you were playing
the box
thing.
said 10% of the people in the U.S. would not be able to see the 3D and may get into an epileptic seizure.
Well, exactly, and right
That's
there,
not Nintendo's fault.
No, and right there was the problem with the system from the get-go, because you're automatically being told by the company you may buy this system
and you may die.
Yes, you may die, but 10% of the people who buy the system won't be able to see the 3D. So what's the point?
It's the same thing as the 3DS.
No, but what's the point? But what's the point of buying it if you're not going to see it?
Oh, side note: did you see the Kickstarter of the company that rigged up the game where when you get hit in the video game, it actually draws blood from you for real?
What?
They want to do it for like
are you kidding
like blood
me?
banks. They hooked up. You got a real not a segue, just sidetrack here. I think Kickstarter took it down.
Thank God.
They hooked up to the guy was playing Call of Duty. It hooked up to the rumble, so every time the controller rumbled, it actually pulled blood out of you, and started filling up a blood bank. And the guy, like halfway through, the guy's like, "I gotta stop."
Yeah, you know how many people will die?
Well, again,
what's gonna stop it from taking all of your blood?
Again, it's. I'm sure the idea behind it is to for blood banks and everything like that. But yeah, it was pretty wild. I forgot what I was going. Oh yeah, so you guys familiar with the history of the Game Boy as far as how it's progressed? Game Boy, Color, Game Boy Pocket. Do you remember the Game Boy Advance Micro?
Really, I've heard of it.
Okay.
No, I remember Game Boy. I remember Game Boy Advance.
Yes, Game Boy Advance, and then Game Boy Advance SP, which I have my SpongeBob version right over there by the computer. But then they made Game Boy Advance Micro, or Game Boy Micro, I think they called it. Basically, it was. I actually had one around here somewhere. It was literally.
You would still have it.
I love I collect Game Boys, definitely. Yes, you know what? Now I gotta find it. Now I think about it. It had. Maybe not even. I think the whole system was 3 inches.
Wow.
Yeah, it was meant to be literally portable. Put it in your pocket, go wherever you have to go. The screen was crystal clear because it was so small, but it played all the Game Boy Advance games, and that definitely didn't stay. Not because of poor sales. I think just time was coming. They moved on to the DS, and pretty much the history of the Game Boy franchise, ran its course, which was fine. It ran from '89 to whatever. So. But yeah, that's pretty much.
Do you remember the Lynx?
Oh god, the Atari Lynx. I forgot about that.
Lynx was crazy.
Yes. Yeah, the 16-bit handheld Atari.
Yep. Oh man, how about the Nomad?
And then after that, Atari died, right?
The Nomad you were able.
System-wise, yeah.
Yeah, the Nomad you were able to play your actual Sega Genesis.
Yep, it was a portable, and it was first party too. Yep. And Sega put it out.
Not to be confused with Game Gear, which was actually a really good handheld.
Game Gear was awesome.
Yeah, Game Gear was actually a really.
Never had the TV attachment. I always wanted the TV attachment. Never quite got it.
Yeah.
So, all right, folks, we're going to wind this one here to a close. And but yeah, I'm sure there's a lot more systems out there that should have lasted and didn't, or just flopped on its way out. Pulled a Shockmaster and just did not work.
And just so you know, the Virtual Boy in the U.S. lasted 8 months.
Wow,
29 games in total,
and it was still. It still overstayed its welcome.
I dare you, sir. All right, well, that, folks, I'm Larry, Anthony C. Say goodbye.
Later, y'all. Have a great weekend. Be safe out there.
Until next time.
Follow everywhere. You can especially follow me on every pretty much social media that's out there. Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. This thing, download it. It's not called this thing. Snapchat I'm on now because that's pretty cool. More 365, MOHR 365. Tweet us what you think is a system that may have probably not overstayed its welcome or lasted too soon or whatever it's called. Be that as it said, I'm done. Good night, everybody. Have a wonderful weekend.